So, welcome everyone to this wonderful panel discussion on reclaiming repro, resisting abortion bans, trans antagonism, and white supremacy. Before we get started, we just want to let folks know about how to access our Spanish language interpretation. So Elizabeth, if you would read that statement for folks before we get started.
Of course. Those who need interpretation into Spanish, please hover over the bottom of the screen, click Interpretation, then Spanish. Las personas que necesiten interpretación al español, por favor, pongan el cursor sobre la parte de abajo de la pantalla, hagan clic en Interpretation y luego hagan clic en Spanish.
Thank you so much. So my name is Melissa Moore. I use they and them pronouns. I'm the Low Country Manager with WREN. First, I want to thank our Spanish language interpreters, Kyle and Alejandro from Comunicar, and our ASL interpreter, Karina Poupard from South Carolina Interpreting Services for the Deaf. I'll walk us through some quick housekeeping. The panel discussion tonight will run until about 7:15. Then we'll dive into audience Q&A. Attendees can ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Other attendees will not be able to access your comments or questions so that the space remains as safe as possible. And if anyone posts harassing comments or questions, they will be removed from the webinar. People who view this content on Facebook Live can post questions in the comments section, but please be aware that there will be about a 30-second delay. WREN has a mission to advance the health, economic well-being, and rights of South Carolina's women, girls, gender-expansive people, and their families. A lot of folks worked hard this year to resist attacks on reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy that have been sweeping the country. Attacks like the abortion ban that passed in South Carolina this session, and the ban on transgender student athletes that we defeated not once, not twice, but 5 times, and we're now working on number 6. But we're not here to give you a legislative update. This fabulous panel was curated by my phenomenal friend and fellow organizer, E.K. Hoffman. So I will hand it over to here to put tonight's discussion into context for you.
Hi, my name is E.K. Hoffman. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that introduction. I use they, them, or ze, here pronouns. I helped to coordinate this panel, and in that process, several questions came to mind for us, including whose autonomy is being restricted, who is trying to control what and to what end, and whose body is the ideal body. I don't necessarily have the answers to these questions, but what I can definitely see, and what many of you can see, is that bodily autonomy is constantly attacked, particularly for people forcibly marginalized along the lines of race and gender. Reclaiming the legislated body means resisting these attacks against our communities while inspecting how they perpetuate reproductive sexism, trans antagonism, and white supremacy. These are ambitious topics to cover in a short time, but I am excited to hear where this panel takes us. Today, I am pleased to welcome Kim Smith, Quinn Brown, Naomi Simmons-Thorne, and Elizabeth Hauk in sharing their thoughts, experiences, and expertise on reclaiming repro, resisting abortion bans, trans antagonism, and white supremacy. And now I'm going to pass it to Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you, EK. And thank you all for being here tonight. And a special thanks to the other folks who I get to join in conversation. So like EK mentioned, this is a really ambitious topic because there's multiple topics inside of it, and they're incredibly and inextricably connected to each other. And so I first and foremost want to acknowledge what may not be here, who is not here with us tonight. We may not be able to uplift all of the voices, including those of Indigenous folks and disabled folks, and we may not be able to even go into every topic very deeply. This is just one of many conversations around bodily autonomy. And so not every voice is able to join us right now. So I would encourage you to ask questions along the way, make those comments, and engage with us while we're having this conversation. And hopefully this is just one of many ongoing conversations. So a shout out to WREN to consider doing that in the future, because we know the ways in which we're limited, but we also know the ways in which we're incredibly grateful to be able to be together in this virtual space tonight. So I am going to start I'll state my own name and pronouns before I ask the panelists to join me in doing so. My name again is Elizabeth Hauk. I use they and she pronouns. I am based here in East Cherokee and Congaree land, aka Columbia, South Carolina. And my personal and professional and community work intersect with this as someone who organizes with Southerners on New Ground, which is a queer and trans regional liberation group. But I'm also a holistic body practitioner and practice yoga and movement in my own life, among other somatic practices. So that's what's grounding me into the space to get today. So I'm going to pass it over to Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Smith. I don't use any pronouns. I'm here from Columbia, South Carolina, and as an organizer with Party for Socialism and Liberation, we are, a socialist, a communist organization, and we make sure to put all parts of the struggle at the forefront, and that includes fighting for reproductive justice and making sure that those issues are talked about and uplifted.
Quinn, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey everyone, my name is Quinyana, but people typically call me Quinn. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently the sexual health program coordinator at the University of South Carolina. I work within student health services, soon to become university health services. And my role primarily revolves around sex education for students, and in some cases, faculty staff here on campus. So that can really range from basic information about sexual health and healthy relationships on to accessing different services, whether it be birth control or STI testing or what have you.
And Naomi, who is definitely here with us, but is not able to be with us on camera. So Naomi, I'll ask you the same.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Naomi Simmons-Thorne, she, her pronouns. I am a graduate student at the University of South Carolina studying education and schooling. Outside of my work in the academy, I'm also a grassroots organizer and I work around lots of queer and trans issues. I do apologize that I'm not able to be on camera today, but tech inequality is a thing. And we will continue having conversations about inequalities and the various ways that they manifest themselves, both in this space and outside.
Definitely, thank you for that. And Kim, there was a question. Can you just restate the organization you organize with?
I'm with the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Thanks for that. So we're going to dive into our first question. I'm just watching this clock, and really want to create as much space that we have to share our thoughts. So the first is, I just want to acknowledge, there's work being done on the legislative level, and you can find those updates on the legislative agenda on WREN's website. Hopefully they'll include a link in the comments. But I am more curious to know, particularly from the three other people who are here in conversation with me, of what else is being done outside of legislative processes regarding to, we can really get into it as far as resisting abortion bans, the trans antagonism, or dismantling white supremacy.
I could take that one.
Yeah.
A lot of on the ground work that's happening is people are, continuously going, having demos and actions and kind of uplifting their struggles around this, especially in South Carolina. And a lot of people are also providing a lot of services for their communities on their own. They're giving people access, giving people information to help them access proper reproductive care. giving them rides and doing different things like that. So it's people organizing and doing things in all facets, from calling demos to protest actions, and also doing all kinds of community education around these issues as well.
Yeah, anything else? I mean, really, and I want to just throw some ideas around there in case this might invite something, but community, anything around community care or this reclamation of the body, or even the ways in which we're reimagining the world that is without these things.
Yeah, so to that point, one of the things that I've been really excited about is that when you mentioned the reimaginings, and so I've been really excited about the fact that we are pulling into our long legacies and histories of attacks and assaults on reproductive justice, and recovering those historical legacies so that, one, we can center people who need to be centered and who haven't been centered for quite some time, but also so we can reclaim our dispossessed personhoods in various kinds of ways. And so one of the examples that has comes immediately to mind, of course, is the actions against various kinds of memorabilia and celebrations, public celebrations of Marion Sims. And so that movement has been one of the ones I've found that I continue to draw lots of inspiration from. And so Marion Sims, of course, often hailed as the father of gynecology, and we all know who his testing subjects and experiments were on, Black women. And so there's been a movement that has been moving across not only just the United States, but also internationally, of folks rethinking the legacies of medical abuse, the medicalization of our lives, and how all of those things also intersect with the fight for reproductive justice. Because not only are we like dealing with the legislative work, but we're also dealing with the institutional piece. And so with the institutional piece is also something that we have to also like think about while we're fighting for reproductive justice as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so much in that. And so, Quinn, I kind of want to hear from you a little bit, just because Naomi started talking about the medicalization of the bodies, and I'm sure that there might be something you might have to say.
Okay. No, for sure. I feel a bit out of place in terms of just the folks in the room, because it's actually been a realization that I've been working through in the years that I've been at UFSC. And I work within a system and I work within a space where more often than not, it has acted as an agent of oppression and of discrimination, of an outright harm. So I do recognize that. And I think that one thing that I'm excited about, much like Naomi, is that we are starting to at least recognize and acknowledge that. Far too often during my journey as a social worker and as a public health practitioner, we come from a space where, we often act in a way that we think that we know what's right, and we speak for others, and we project what our concept and what our definition of health is and what it means to be healthy. And so in doing that over our legacy, we've done a lot of harm to people, especially people of color, Black women, trans folks, and countless of other, people. And so I'm very excited about the fact that we're just starting to make that step. Excitement definitely doesn't feel like the most appropriate word, because as we've, talked about in the past, we're still doing the bare basics in terms of the work that needs to be done. But it is nice to not always be the only person in the room that, one, looks like me, but two, have some of the same priorities that, I've come to really try to instill in the care that I try to provide to people.
Yeah, I, for one, appreciate that acknowledgement, because there's so much in the way that we have been colonized and our minds have been colonized, that sometimes this desire to reimagine a world without, I mean, a lot, even the three main topics, we're saying resist abortion bans, we're saying dismantle white supremacy, and we're saying, you know, we're fighting against trans antagonism. And so it's these against, and this pushing. And it's, you know, what exists beyond that? And how do we even get to a point where our minds are free enough to be there? And so it's an ongoing journey, and realizing that many of the ways that we've even learned about these subjects were incredibly colonizing, and steeped in white supremacy. And that's just immediately what comes to mind, because I mean, I mentioned in the beginning that my practice in movement and learning yoga in particular, it required a ton of decolonization, right? Particularly being a person here in the West. And so while I'm on this journey of reclaiming my own body as a survivor of sexual assault, even that, realizing that this reclamation of what I thought my body was as a mixed race person is steeped in white supremacy too, right? And these things are so interconnected. And so when we even think about choice and choosing to think differently or reimagine, choice is so politicized now. And I kind of want to just see what other folks might be thinking around the politicization of choice, and how we work and move in that.
I know for me, choice especially is ironic to focus on, just because within the sphere that I work with, and within, there aren't always a lot of choices that people can really access. So I think about it in a twofold way, in the sense that we we try to highlight one's opportunity to have those choices and navigate. I'm thinking of it from a healthcare perspective, you know, navigating care, accessing care, when more often than not, especially when you focus on, um, you know, women, Black women, trans folks, especially, um, we haven't really afforded them a lot of choices to be taken care of and make informed choices. We don't inform them. We don't inform ourselves to be able to provide the level of care that, you know, we all deserve. And so for me, the focus on choice, is an oxymoron in a sense, because I still don't believe that we have, you know, provided enough choices for people to even access and attempt to navigate.
Yeah, I just really agree with Quinn. These attacks are attacks on the working class. So the working class doesn't have a choice. There is no choice. You know, the choices are really left to the people who have the money, and the have the money and have the access and have the power. You know, point blank, the ruling class. Those are the people with choices. You know, poor and working class people are the ones that are under attack. Our reproductive rights are under attack, and we don't have a choice. We don't have the choice to get a good education on reproductive justice. We don't have a choice to get a good education. Those things aren't afforded to us. So yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, someone shared in the comments that it's a bounded choice, and you're having to choose between bad and worse. And often, I'm thinking about this sense of resistance, and often it's really coming from a place of lack, right? So as we're trying to even shift into the abundance of reimagining the world we want to be in and all that kind of thing, a lot of times there is just lack that we're confronted with, and scarcity that we're constantly reminded of, that particularly white supremacy in everything that it touches has a say in, and dictates, in fact, not even has a say in of like, do you want this or this? It tells us. And in many cases, that means that our bodies are offered without our consent. And we don't have a choice, or it's simply being in a place of, well, okay, what now? And often there may not be, you may just be met with an echo of your own voice, and this kind of chamber of there not being a response of what these options actually are, because there may not be any options, particularly here in South Carolina. So, I think at this point, I'd be curious then to see what needs to be done in order to, I guess we can really start with resisting abortion bans, and then we can get into the other topics and see what might be unearthed there. But what do you think needs to be done? And this can just come from your personal opinion. Or like one thing, because of course there's about 700 things that need to be done, right?
Well, one thing I would say is I think we need to make it and ensure that it's politically toxic for anyone who is a policymaker to be able to either introduce or legislate an abortion ban in any kind of way. It needs to be politically toxic. Doing so should make you so beyond the reproach of electability that no one would even dare instituting or even trying to institute such a policy. And unfortunately, it's not the case. And it's not the case largely because abortions are an immensely politicized culture war issue. Two unproductive polls.
I think Naomi's sound might have gone out for a moment. Hopefully she'll be able to join us in a second. Well, we'll keep an ear out. We'll pay attention, and hopefully she'll be able to share the rest of what she was saying. And I want to also say I'm asking this question right to people who didn't create this problem, so I want to acknowledge that too. How can we take this to a place of imagining and less of problem solving, because it's really not the onus of any of us. So I just want to say that before we get any deeper. But I'm definitely curious to hear what thoughts you might have.
I mean, I just, agree with Naomi. Like legislators they are able to write these into law. They're able to even bring these bills to the House. The fact that they have the right and can do that is the problem. And it's the problem because people are, people don't take enough time to educate about reproductive justice and to educate about the history of white supremacy and how poor Black working class women, how our bodies have always been under attack, and how so many African Americans, period, with the prison system are continuously having their bodies under attack and modified. We have to continue to educate people on these things, and also making sure that we actually are trying to dismantle the system, because we can talk to each other all we want about this, but if we aren't actively doing the work to dismantle the system, to get these legislators out and to actually fight for a system that does meet the needs of people and does meet the needs of trans women, Black trans women, working class Black women, all these people who are under attack are in general, that's the first thing that we have to do to consciously do the work of dismantling the system.
I completely agree with Kim and was very excited. And I'm happy to see that Naomi is back, because I feel like we were about to get a word. But in my mind, when you initially posed that question, Elizabeth, I really thought back, because again, I'm thinking with my sexual health educator brain. And more often than not, when we've talked about health education and legislation around that, that growth, that progress has been ridiculously slow. Especially within the state, we're still arguing about what it means to have comprehensive health education, and we're still arguing about what is defined as, age appropriate or medically accurate information. And so, even if we were to take the actual dismantling of these systems out, because I mean that's immense work to be done, and as Kim alluded to, we still have lots of work to do. Even if we just focused on the education, I feel like more often than not, abortion is highly politicized, but then also it's connected to people's definitions and norms around worth. And there's a lot of blame and shame and stigma And so when I relate that back to sexual health and what I have to, the muck that I have to navigate and sort through when I'm trying to create, relevant humility and comprehensive programs, it's very difficult because I'm also having to wade through people's thoughts and feelings and judgments about sex and who should be having sex and how they should be having sex. And so when it comes to abortion, I think about pregnancy, obviously, and more often than not, when someone gets pregnant, who gets blamed? Whose fault is it? Who's who's left with that burden, so to speak? And so I think because of all of those things, it gets even more difficult from an educator, from a preventionist perspective, because, what do you address first? Because I have to jump through so many hoops to create programs to even inform someone. So Kim mentioned education, um, because that system in itself is so muddied and scarred with oppression, white supremacy, what have you. It's difficult for me to even create something to appeal to, you know, Black women, working class folks, as Kim mentioned, trans folks, because I have to jump through systematic hoops and hurdles. I was rambling, but
No,
I
I
think I
think
made sense.
there's definitely something you said in there that really brought attention to me as far as how these are cultural, right? Like this is culture work, and even trying to explain that white supremacy is a concept in a world that is white supremacist, right? It's like it's just the norm. You're having to overcome this kind of point blank belief and what is taught to us from the moment we come into the world, right? Like however we got here is we're already learning, and much more when you get into trans antagonism, and much more when you get into abortion, and even as people who are capable of reproducing, it's like, well, what is your opinion on this? And people will ask you, or at least hold a certain expectation of what you should think. And what a dangerous word, should. It's from that moment that decisions get made for us, and there's very little room to question the should, because at that point it's in order, and not a conversation, not ever something that's an invitation of, what do you actually think, and or here are other ways of thinking, and here's more education around this. Yeah, Naomi, I want to hear from you because it seems like you got cut off at the moment, and like Quinn said, I think we were about to get a word from you.
Yeah, I apologize about that. Hopefully I don't have any more tech interruptions though, but what I was just saying, and I'll just say very succinctly, I was just saying that that any attempts to limit, restrict, roll back reproductive rights needs to become politically toxic. And unfortunately, it's not in this environment. And so we have an environment, unfortunately, where we have the exact converse, where attacks on reproductive rights is incentivized fiscally and otherwise. And so in this environment, we are kind of gridlocked into this very unproductive system where we become the collateral damage for these very unproductive poles of our electoral system. And I have to implicate both because I also remember back in February when Nancy Pelosi said we need a strong Republican Party. And if this is what the Republican Party is doing, I'm not sure, while the resistance party would say we need a strong one. So our bodies right now are collateral damage in this electoral game, which is really just a legislative industry. There's the whole industry around just putting these legislating these policies, introducing them to legislatures, even if they go nowhere. And so right now, we don't have the converse that we need, where these issues need to be politically toxic. We have a system where they are actually fiscally incentivized.
Yeah, that's an incredible point. And I'm thinking, I thought of this sort of image of a garden, and how, and even just pulling out weeds, like weeds will very happily take over anything else that's trying to grow in that, and how in even just creating the sense of what can grow, That's an interesting concept of politically toxic, and I don't think I've heard it quite like that. And how, how do we actually make it so that certain ideas and certain policies cannot grow and cannot go on to come to pass? Um, you know, I don't know if there's any more thoughts on. Well, I mean, I guess I do. I do want to get into what folks think about trans antagonism as it relates to this. I think we've touched a bit more on white supremacy and abortion bans, but I would definitely want to hear more on what do you think needs to be done on an individual level or a community level or system level? And also keeping in mind we didn't create these problems. So if it doesn't feel like this is really where we want to venture into, that's fine, and we can talk about something else.
I think I can at least acknowledge from a healthcare perspective that we would need to own up to our history and to our present. I think it's really important to acknowledge and stop hiding around the fact that we're attempting to take care of people. And I really think that it's time to acknowledge that, in someone's oath to do no harm, they've caused an immense amount of harm. And working within health and working within sexual health specifically, I think we need and have a lot to acknowledge and own up to in terms of the lack of care we've provided to certain people. And then I think from also the perspective of preventative care or being a health educator, we definitely need to kind of call out and acknowledge the ways in which we have and continue to be antagonistic towards trans folks. I think far too often, especially when I think back to, different professional development opportunities that I've been able to work within, being amongst other educators, but specifically clinical providers, I feel like far too often people feign behind ignorance and make the claim that they're learning or that they're trying and don't acknowledge that in some ways their actions speak otherwise. And this isn't a space where you're allowed to be ignorant or to be unaware. I think far too often a lot of providers that I've worked with and been within in terms of company just are far too comfortable not knowing and being in that place of learning.
Yeah, I think one thing I often will hear is people are like, "Well, where do I start?" Right? Like it is, and I can understand that. Sometimes I have to be like, "Okay, well, Google exists," but I also can understand that Google is also an overwhelming resource, right? So, I mean, are there any certain, I mean, be it books or podcasts or resources that people could dive into that might be able to get a little bit more deep into that trans antagonism? Because I certainly don't think the best use of our last 10 minutes we have together is getting into all the ways in which um, people's bodies have been incredibly uncared for, but that might be useful for folks tuning in.
Really quickly, I will also tie this into the question that you posed about books and resources and other things, but really quickly, I think right now with the attacks that we're seeing on trans rights, trans people's reproductive rights, and et cetera, I think right now it's really important to know what the ultimate end goal is and also how we got to this point as well. And so what I've already mentioned is that unfortunately, because of this capitalistic system that we live in, there is a legislative culture war industry where people are financially incentivized, regardless of their actual positions, to introduce all kinds of nefarious bills that think tanks and other big donors pay them to introduce. And it's very unfortunate. You can speak to some of these politicians, these policymakers, like some of the folks, some of the WREN folks actually were very instrumental in having these conversations during South Carolina's general session. And you can speak to some of these lawmakers and they literally cannot even tell you what what trans identity is, who trans people are, they have absolutely no clue about any of these things, but they are just being hand-fed these bills from all these think tanks and all these different funders and foundations, and they're just legislating them because they get paid to do so. So obviously capitalism is implicated here in a very perverse way, but it's also important to mention that the attack that we're seeing right now on trans rights very specifically is because conservatives feel like they have lost the war on marriage equality. And so trans people now are the new target victim in the target in the LGBTQ plus community that conservatives see as hyper vulnerable and that they can victimize. And so it's really important to mention that, because we also should mention how LGBTQ orgs have stopped fighting for trans people and other people in the community after marriage equality was won. And so lots of LGBTQ plus organizations who were once extremely active across a range of issues have now become less active, have become less vocal, and are largely acting as mobilizers for the Democratic Party, which is also really unfortunate. Having said that, I think that it's really important to note what the ultimate end goal is here. So if you look at all of these different bills that have been introduced, and some unfortunately that have passed, what these think tanks and the masterminds behind these bills are essentially trying to do is trying to use this as a legislative experiment to get the Supreme Court to effectively define man and woman in extremely binary and narrow ways. And God help us all when that happens. But this is the end goal of this whole legislative experiment. And so it's really important to mention that, because having lost on the social construction of gender and sexuality, conservatives are now trying to get a legal definition of binary man and woman, like legally enshrined. And so it's really problematic, and we should also be very aware that that is the ultimate end goal here. You asked about some like books and podcasts and other things that you can like tune into if you want to learn more about these issues, which everyone should be learning more about these issues because they affect everybody, and they are interconnected into all of these different topics and conversations that we're already talking about. One that I think would probably just be very important to be aware of, especially in this context where conservatives are very actively trying to get a binary definition of man and woman legally enshrined. You should definitely check out the book Sexing the Body by Anne Fausto Sterling. It's an incredible book and explains a lot of these issues in better detail. And I would probably also recommend the book Black on Both Sides by the scholar C. Riley Snorton, also a South Carolina native, that discusses the very particular intersection of trans identity and race, and the ways that Black trans people specifically are hyper visible and marginalized in this entire nexus of trans antagonism as well.
Yeah. Right. Like, thank you for sharing that, Naomi. And there's something in the chat that I wanted to uplift real quick. Someone asked that they read recently that the self-help books for cisgender heterosexuals in the early 20th century were written by eugenicists and published by the Eugenics Publishing Company. As a scholar and philosopher, what is your analysis, this is to Naomi, of the ways that compulsory heterosexuality and cis-sexism is a product of white supremacy, or project of white supremacy?
Black on Both Sides by C. Riley Snorton.
Wait, sorry, can you repeat that? I don't think I understood.
Yes, whoever asked the question should check out the book Black on Both Sides by C. Riley Snorton.
Thank you for that. Yeah, wow. I mean, I think that one, I'm sure that there's people tuning in who are thinking, you know, what can I do next? A lot of times we bring it back to how can we as the individual, and I think that many of us on this call are collective thinkers in many ways. And so I would want to know, what do you feel like people can do next? Kim, you started talking about this, so I would love to have you kick us off.
I think to continue, people need to definitely continue to educate themselves about all of these issues for one, and continue to talk about them and continue. And I think one major thing is to actually, at this point where we are, people need to be joining organizations and collectively fighting against these things. People should be engaging in collective political education, community education, as well as understanding the legislative process like Naomi laid out. A lot of people don't know that this is fully incentivized, like Naomi stated, and learning more about these processes and how this system works and how the system is literally designed and architectured out to continue to oppress the most marginalized, and how this whole idea, this binary of gender and like reproductive rights has literally is a product of a system based on profit. And and we just really need to continue to do those things.
Any other thoughts from Quinn or Naomi on what people can do? What's next?
Yeah, I would say folks definitely need to, no matter what community you're working with, no matter where you center your politics, you have to understand that reproductive justice is involved in any kind of mass action, social justice, liberation project. And so I know that a lot of times we don't hear about reproductive justice until it's legislative season. And that's when people start once again picking up on the issue. And so we go through this very temperamental cycle where folks will be completely silent about this issue, and then like around these legislative seasons, that's when it'll come to the forefront again, and it's always on the defensive. So we need to get a lot more proactive in our fight for reproductive justice, because we're often locked into a defensive posture, which places us at a huge risk and disadvantage. So we need to be more proactive, and we need to understand how reproductive justice is involved in every single struggle that we fight. And so one of the things that I'll even point to, I remember last year during the Floyd uprisings, there were people who lost their reproductive capabilities because of the way they was brutalized by the police. And so we have to understand like how all of these issues are interconnected, and we need to also be extremely proactive in the way that we are championing these issues as well, because all too often we are on the defensive side, and that does a huge disservice and places us at a great disadvantage as well.
Quinn, are there any ways that people can get involved that you feel? I mean, even if it's from the education standpoint, I mean, that's powerful too.
I first want to acknowledge that like Kim and Naomi give me all kinds of words. But I think an interesting and necessary first step for some folks would be to take that step. As Naomi referenced, we are constantly, more often than not, reacting. We've done that as a field within healthcare for the longest, forever. Even as a preventionist, more often than not, I'm acting in a reactive way. So I think that on the individual level, people can definitely take that first step and make the attempt and acknowledge, where they are and where they want to be, and set those goals, and try to devise ways to gain the knowledge and to get involved and make the action, because it can be very intimidating. I can acknowledge that, because of the way that we've conceptualized sex, reproductive health in general, especially. A lot of times people see it as, a very private thing, and they don't think about different ways that they could lend or help or support or uplift other people. And so I think that first initial step is to decide where you want to go, and try to build from there.
Yeah, that is important. And I mean, it's something that all three of you in one way or another have really said, you know, like what's on the other side, right? Like what's on the other side of this. And so I kind of want to see in the way that we've heard on what's on the other side of these binary gender legislations, which if anybody has resources to share on that, that would be helpful for me as an individual level to learn more about. But I'd be curious to what are we envisioning as our other side of white supremacy, the other side of resisting abortion bans and trans antagonism.
I think, on the other side of that is liberation. Um, and and not just for here. I just also want to make sure that we're understanding that this fight for reproductive justice is not just an American fight. So when we talk about the other side, we also talk about liberation, for the women of Palestine, the people of Palestine, the people of, Nigeria who are facing their own reproductive attacks, the people all across the diaspora and in different countries who are also, because of the American policies and because of American imperialism, they are also their reproductive justice under attack. So when we look at the other side, we want global liberation from these policies and from these legislators and from white supremacy that does this to us and makes us have to fight for this.
Yeah, I also want to give an additional shout out to those who are in ICE detention centers right now, particularly coming up from South and Central America. And there's been so much against controlling the reproductive rights of the women in ICE detention and people who can reproduce. That is absolutely global, and I think for often it's tempting to just fall into a Western perspective, but I completely agree with you, Kim, that it's all over because it is white supremacy and white supremacy as a global idea. What about you, Naomi? What are you thinking is on the other side? Not to be binary about it.
So I just am gonna have to echo everything that Kim brilliantly said. On the opposite side of this is liberation and freedom from all of these constraints and limitations and restrictions. I know for me personally, I think that I would be happy the day when, I am not forced to amputate my genitals in order to get a passport or to get a driver's license with my correct gender marker. That would be amazing. So I think that the opposite side to me looks exactly like what Kim said: freedom from these oppressive systems, freedom from all of these ways of constraining, restricting, and creating hierarchies and stratifying bodies.
Quinn, what about you? Any other thoughts?
I mean, both Kim and Naomi spoke on so much, and I think that they've been able to like put into words or in a way that I don't think I could. Um, so I definitely want to acknowledge that. I think that on the other side, I also think about the choice. We talked about choices before. On the other side, I see there actually being a choice and being options. Um, Again, I can acknowledge I'm very heavily rooted from that health perspective, but having worked in this arena, I definitely see liberation and freedom, but I also think about freedom from shame. And as Naomi mentioned, like those restrictions, but the shame piece I see very heavily rooted and intertwined within a lot of the work that I do. So I think about that a lot as well, the shame and the judgment, and how those definitions and those confines have manifested in our systems. So I definitely, at the very least, wanted to add that to that perspective as well, because I do feel like that is a huge part of a lot of the barriers that we face, and I think it's a catalyst or a way in which, or at least people are able to use that to facilitate a lot of the toxic um, legislation and policies and systems that we still see today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really this reimagining a world. I mean, and it feels like, I mean, it is a reimagining, right? Because at some point down the line, someone imagined this for whatever reason, but someone imagined this, and it's really imagining a world where it's filled with liberation, with abundance, and it's not nothing is a should, and our bodies and our minds and the ways in which we live our lives are not legislated or limited or controlled by this external force. And we have a plethora of choices before us that we're able to make freely and without shame. So I really appreciate y'all visioning and offering that, because I feel like I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this, because it feels like every word that's been said has really just been like, okay, wait, hold on, another thought. So I do want to open it up to any questions and check in with those who might be commenting on Facebook. And I see a question here about, loving the conversation about what we need freedom from. So, in the mindset of abundance, what should we have freedom to?
Um, you know, when I think about freedom and liberation, I think about how we should just have the freedom to be. We should have the freedom. Like, my grandparents should have the freedom. My granddaddy's 76 years old and doesn't work. He should have the freedom to not have to work at 76 years old. My mother should have the freedom not to have to rely on disability that doesn't even come all the time to live and pay her bills. She should have the freedom not to worry about rent. Like, we it's so many things that we should have the freedom to do and to be and to grow. My mom should have had the freedom to be able to not have to, not have to defend her choice to make an abortion. I should have the freedom that I don't have to defend my choice to get an abortion. For the women and children incarcerated, they should have the freedom to be outside and playing and not be criminalized because of poverty and lose that autonomy over their bodies.
Someone mentioned in the comment the freedom to not have to explain yourself, also, which I think coincides with some of what you're saying, Kim, but I mean, certainly not all of it, because there's that sense of freedom to be, and also to live and experience radical joy. I mean, like, what a concept whenever we really start thinking in abundance of how are we able to access what enjoyment in this lifetime can look like.
I really like what Kim said in terms of being. It seems so simple, but in its essence, I think it's perfect, because simply, like, can we just be? Can I exist? I think about it also, freedom to not just like be, exist. I think about like being able to feel safe, feel, or at the very least act in a way which you feel free. I mentioned shame earlier. I also think about judgment. Um, Initially, when you did pose that question and thought about freedom, I think about it in the sense that far too often we focused our definitions on ideals and things that have been written through a tainted lens. So it's more than just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because as we all know, and I think we're dealing with it now, those definitions have been restricted and skewed in such a way that they're just not real for people. They're not attainable for people, especially Black folks, trans folks, working class folks, as Kim has mentioned. It's just not even a reality. And so I really think about it in terms of just freedom from restriction and shame and judgment, and freedom to existing and being, and having that access to even just take the step or not take the step.
Yeah, thanks for that from both of y'all. Naomi, is there anything that you want to share?
Yeah, I think I would just add freedom to define myself for myself, freedom to define my own body, and freedom to say what it is that my body needs or doesn't need. And right now, of course, the ability to do any of those things are greatly limited and prohibited for so many folks. And freedom for me definitely includes freedom to do precisely that.
Yeah, when I think of this, I think of like the freedom to move my body when and where I want to, because as someone who was born into this body, I have a lot of fear when I'm in certain places, particularly at night and those type things. Like it would just be really like the idea of just going out and sitting somewhere at nighttime and not having to even think twice about who was gonna do anything to me in this patriarchal world. Like that feels so radical because it's beyond anything I've ever gotten to do. Um, and and that's also me as someone who has that freedom to do even that, right? And I think of like these, it's just getting to like to do and explore and create and love and just like be in these ways without all this extra stuff that's layered and piled on top of it and compounds it and makes those things nearly impossible. So I mean, I guess to this question, that's sort of what I think, the having the freedom to is just is to do, I don't know, the things that I guess other people in the world are doing, or some other people in the world are doing, that I may not know in the near future, but hopefully with we keep building and we keep imagining and creating. I don't know if there are any final questions or final thoughts that we want to share in this time. We have about a minute left, but I, do want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And well, there was a question earlier about Instagram handles or social media. If y'all feel inclined to share that on after the fact with WREN, I'm those who want to share can share. So I'm not gonna take this time to blast that out. But there's currently no questions from social media, so I appreciate that, and appreciate being able to honor our finite time together in this way. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kim and Quinn and Naomi, for being here. And y'all really said some profound things, and I hope we're able to sit with these words and hopefully make something of it and take that action that Kim was referring to earlier in particular. And continue to educate ourselves and continue to question everything and see these different degrees of separation that we have to white supremacy and capitalism, and the ways in which we can change and co-create something together. So thank you all so much, and I hope you all take care and stay safe.